Good morning, guys. Welcome to day 3 of building the skin-on frame shearwater. Yesterday, we laminated up those 2 intermediate frames that go between the ends of the boat and the center of the boat. I just finished taking off all the clamps and cleaning up the table. And today, the mission is we're going to try to laminate the outer stems that are going to mate up with the inner stems. I showed you earlier the plans. Basically, this particular boat has inner stems and an inner keel, and outer stems and an outer keel, and those outer stems need to be laminated just like the inner stems. Now, for this particular task, it's gonna be a little bit different than what we did before. Instead of screwing blocks down to the table, we're gonna be using the stems themselves as our laminating forms. And so what I've done here is I just went ahead and cleaned up both sides of these with a chisel and a power planer, but I was really careful not to make them very thin because we want this to have as much width as possible so it gives us good backing for our clamping. Now, something we've got to do before we start this process is I also need to check to make sure that this surface on the outside is actually flat and square to the table, because what can happen sometimes is this outer surface can cup a little bit, and then if you try to use that as the backing for your clamping, it just doesn't give you a very solid connection. And there's actually a reason that this happened, and that is because I didn't use a backing strip when I was making this lamination. And so in this next lamination, you're going to see me using a strip of 1/4 inch thick, high density polyethylene to spread the force a little bit better on the outer lamination to prevent exactly this issue. The only reason I didn't do it is because honestly, I just didn't have the material with me at the time, and I figured I'd try and see if I could get away without it. But it's not too hard to clean up this particular issue. So why don't we put this down on the table, and I'm going to show you how we flatten this surface. Okay, so starting out with the tools we've got here, I've got the Stanley low angle block plane. I just put a razor sharp edge on this, and I closed the throat down really far so I'm not accidentally gonna rip out any grain. The other thing that I have is a block of wood that has some 60 grit sandpaper spray glued to the front of it. And the key to making this particular block of wood is you want to make sure the sandpaper is spaced a 1/64 of an inch up on the block, and the ends of it are just slightly rounded over. And the reason for that is if you have the sandpaper just a little bit off the table, you can run this like this on top of the table without tearing up the plastic and without tearing up the table. Now, other thing that I've got here is just a little square block. This just happens to be one of my laminating blocks. It doesn't really matter what it is. And we're going to use this by sliding it around the curve. And while you're doing this, you want to look at the gap between the block and this, and that's going to tell you where you're going to need to do a little bit of work. So, for example, as I'm sliding this around, I'm seeing a gap at the top, so that lets me know that I'm going to need to take off some material down by the bottom right here. So if it's just a gap on one side, the easiest way to cut this material away is with your block plane. So why don't we just flip this over for a second. And so there's the area that I want to take a little bit of material off of. I'm going to take my block plane, I'm going to put it on its side directly on the table like this, and I'm going to start working it around this corner. Now, while you're doing this, you want to make sure you're taking long, smooth strokes. You don't want to focus on one area too much because you're going to end up making a little flat spot or a little uneven spot in the curve. Okay, so once you've done that a couple times, you want to grab your block and you want to check it to see if it's square. Okay, so now it looks like I've got a tiny high spot in the middle right here. So how I'm going to deal with that is I'm going to take this sanding block right here, I'm going to put it on the table, okay, and then I'm going to check it again. So now when I slide this square block along the table, I don't have any gaps between the block and the face of this here, which means that this face is nice and flat and nice and square. And now this is going to be a really good clamping surface. Now, this was just an example. Normally, I go ahead and check out the entire thing to see what I need to accomplish before I start working one section. The longer sections you can work, the more smooth and even your curve is going to be. Now, another thing you want to pay attention to while you're doing this is you want to make sure you don't accidentally sand off the layout lines that you transferred up from the plans. So you can see here, I've been working this with a little bit of sandpaper, and I have almost erased my setup line and my shear line. So before those disappear completely, I'm just going to come in here with my pencil and I'm going to redraw them along with any appropriate symbols. Okay, so taking a quick look at the laminating setup, you can see that I've got the inner stem here and I've spaced it up off the table with these little 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch blocks. Now, keep in mind, I'm probably gonna leave a couple of these in place when I'm done. So any of these that you're gonna leave in place, you wanna make sure you put some packing tape on the surface of them so they don't end up sticking to your lamination. Now, something else I've done here is I've screwed a stick on the top between both ends of the stem. And the reason I did that is so the tension of the outer lamination doesn't cause the stem to flex open and change the shape of that outer lamination into something that we don't want it to be. Also, you can see at the end here, I have actually screwed the stem down to the table. I've got a screw here and I've got a screw here, and that's because I don't want this thing moving around on me while I'm trying to work. Now, last thing I've got is this piece of 1/4 inch thick, high density polyethylene. Just for fun, I figured I'd do an experiment this time. I have one of these that's smooth and one of them that has texture, and I'm gonna see which one works the best. But basically, we're gonna be using this to back the curve. So when I come over here with all those epoxy soaked laminations, I'm gonna sandwich them together behind this piece and press everything together like this. And then hopefully this outer piece will add a little bit more rigidity, which means that we won't have any gaps, even with our wider clamp spacing, just so we can avoid that cupping issue that we had earlier. Now, over here on the clamp cart, you can see I've got a bunch of engagement clamps, I've got a bunch of screw clamps, and once again, we can't use spring clamps for this, so it's all gotta happen with clamps that have at least a 4.5 inch wide opening. And just like before, I'm probably going to pull the lamination around the curve with these engagement clamps and then replace it with these screw clamps. But just something to keep in mind, anytime you're using screw clamps on epoxy, you want to make sure you don't over tighten these, because if you tighten these too much, you're going to squeeze all the epoxy out of the joint and you're not going to have a good glue joint. Now, coming back up here, very last thing, you can see that I've got this packing tape here. I'm going to tape this all the way around the outside of this with the smooth side facing out. That way, these laminations don't accidentally stick together. And then, like I said before, any of these spacer blocks that I'm gonna leave in place, I'm also gonna put packing tape on just so they don't end up gluing to the underside of the lamination. All right, so I think we're all set here. I'm gonna go ahead and glove up and I'm gonna do this first outer stem lamination off camera just to get my mojo. And then I'm gonna go grab Tom and I'm gonna have him do the other outer stem lamination so I can film the process so you guys can see it. All right, so we just finished the outer stem laminations. First lamination was an absolute disaster because while I was pumping the epoxy pump actually separated on me and the bottom half fell into the bottom of the can. So there was about 3 minutes of panic there where we were trying to fish that out of the can and get those two halves reconnected. Hopefully I ended up with at least an acceptable epoxy ratio, and that back lamination there is going to cure correctly. Really not going to know until tomorrow when I take all the clamps off. Now, second lamination actually went beautifully. That was the one that Tom was doing while I was filming it. Pretty happy with the 5-inch spacing on the screw clamps. Once again, I'm not putting too much pressure on those screw clamps because you don't want to squeeze all the epoxy out and starve the joint. Engagement clamps would also be fine for that as well. I always try to have at least one screw clamp at either end, but if all you've got is engagement clamps are fine along the length of it because once again, you don't want too much pressure in an epoxy lamination. Now, just a real quick tip here. I was doing an experiment with those high density polyethylene backing strips that were 1/4 inch thick. One of them was completely smooth. The other one was textured. The one that was textured was way less slippery and way easier to use. So I would definitely choose that type of HDPE. Now, before we head on to the next project, just want to give you guys a few tips for working with epoxy. First one, just general safety tips. Anytime you're working with this stuff, you want to have good cross ventilation. I've got fans behind me pulling the air out. I've got fans over here pushing air in. And when I'm not talking to the camera, I'm wearing an organic vapor cartridge respirator. Also, you want to be really careful to keep this stuff off of your skin. I always wear long sleeves and I'm wearing gloves when I'm working with epoxy. Also, just some general tips for working with the epoxy without it turning into a big mess. One of the most important things for me is to clean up as I go. So for example, as soon as I pour the epoxy out of the mixing cup, I like to wipe that cup out with a paper towel. That way I'm going to be able to use it again. And same thing, as soon as I've got all of the epoxy out of the roller tray, I put the roller tray up on an edge in the garbage can. That way any extra can dribble out of the side of it, and I'm going to be able to reuse my roller tray as well. And then finally, for the roller itself, as soon as I'm done rolling, I like to roll that out on a towel or a paper towel. That way I can get all that thick epoxy out of the roller. And then if I'm doing my next lamination right on the heels of my first lamination and it has sufficient open time, I can reuse that same roller for one more laminating sequence. Also, very last thing, I try to clean all my tools and my work surfaces before I step away from the project. Denatured alcohol is perfect for cleaning this stuff up. Just put it on a paper towel. You can wipe down your clamps and you can also wipe down your work tables. That way you don't end up with a big sticky mess. Okay, so that's it for the lamination here. Next up, we're gonna head outside and we're gonna sort through that framing lumber to see if we can find enough long strips that they can be glued together into 17-foot long lumber. I can't find 17-foot long lumber around here, so we're gonna be making it with scarf joints. And then after I've cut the strips, we're gonna take it to the table saw and I'm gonna use my scarfing jig to cut the tapers. And if you're curious about that whole process, make sure you check out the scarfing video that I made here on YouTube. It's a very quick and easy way to scarf up wood as long as it's not taller than 2.5 inches. So anyways, we're gonna head outside. Don't know if we'll get to the actual scarf joints today, but we'll see what we can get done. Good morning, guys, and welcome to day 4 of building the skin-on-frame shearwater. Now, before we jump into today's tasks, I just want to mention something I forgot to mention yesterday, and that is, if you have no idea what this video is about, and it seems like I'm throwing you right into the process, that's because you need to go back and watch the first video in this series where I talk all about the history of this project, what we're building, and what we're hoping to accomplish with this particular design progression. So I'll throw a link up on the screen for that right now that you can check out. Also, if you have no idea who I am, once again, my name is Brian. I've been building skin boats for over 20 years. I offer online video courses and plan sets for how to build skin-on-frame kayaks and canoes. All right, so getting into it here today. Yesterday, you saw that we laminated up the outer stems, which are going to mate obviously to the inner stems and get connected to the inner and outer keel. Today, I'm going to take all the clamps off of those, probably going to clean up those laminations a little bit, and then we're going to clear this table and use it to glue together all of those scarf joints that we cut yesterday on the table saw. So why don't we just go ahead and get started here, and whenever I come to something that's worth talking about, I'll tell you guys. All right, so it looks like the lamination came apart really cleanly. I'm really happy with how this looks. This is 18 layers of 1/8 inch mahogany, and there are no gaps, no voids. There's just enough squeeze out, but there's not very much that I need to clean up. So could not be happier with this particular lamination. I'm gonna go ahead and unscrew this, and then what I'm probably going to do right now is clear off the table and start gluing up those scarf joints. And then when I'm done with that, I'm going to start the task of cleaning all of these laminations down to their finished thickness. Every single one of these is a 1/4 inch thicker than it needs to be right now. So we got a little bit of work ahead of us. All right, let's keep moving. All right, so starting out with the table itself, I've still got the plastic down, and I went ahead and cleaned off any epoxy bumps. And then I went ahead and cut myself a bunch of spacers. These ones happen to be 1 1/4 inch square. They don't have to be this dimension. You just want to make sure they're not less than 1 inch thick, because if they are, you're going to have a difficult time getting the clamps around the scarf joint because you're going to be right up against the table. Now, I also put packing tape on the top of these here. That way the epoxy doesn't stick to it. And the only reason I drew this black line is just so I don't forget which side actually has the packing tape on it. So I've got these spaced all down the table at about 2-foot intervals. And then coming to the middle of the table where we're actually going to be doing the glue up, I've got some tools laid out. So once again, I've got a whole video about this process here on the YouTube channel with a lot more detail, but I'm just going to run you guys through this real quick. So first up here, I've got a spreader stick or a brush. I've got a dial caliper. I got a pencil. I've got a hammer. I've got some ordinary push pins. I've got 5 spring clamps, and I've got a couple of these engagement clamps. And then you're gonna need some type of glue. For the actual glue ups here, I'm gonna be using epoxy, but I'm just gonna do a really quick demonstration for you guys with some scrap wood using this Titebond 3, because once I've got the epoxy going, I can't talk because I'm gonna have a respirator on. So first up here, I've got these 2 pieces of wood that I cut on the taper jig on my table saw. This is a 16:1 taper. So for instance, this is 3/4 of an inch thick. The taper is 12 inches long. That ends up being 16:1, which is a really good ratio for any structural application. So first thing we're gonna do here is double check the thickness of these pieces. So looks like that is a 32nd under 3/4. And then I'm gonna push the tapers together like this. And I'm gonna check the thickness in the middle right here. So that's a little bit over 3/4. So I'm gonna slide these apart, check it again. And what I'm looking for is the middle of this joint to be the same thickness as the pieces that are coming into it from either side. For this particular glue up, I think I'm gonna go a 64th over just as an experiment, but I can't tell you exactly why I'm doing that. So this is now a 64th under 3/4 of an inch right in the middle here. And then I'm gonna make a reference mark on top, like so. So I know where to line this up to when I've got glue on it. All right, next thing we're gonna do is grab some glue and squirt it on here. Once again, I'm gonna use epoxy for my joints, but for this little demonstration here, we're using Titebond. Cool. Go ahead and spread it out. Nice thing about Titebond is that it's pretty non-toxic and it cleans up well with water. It also makes an incredibly strong joint. I just don't use it a lot when it's hot in the summer because at least for bigger laminations, it just doesn't give you enough open time to get everything together before it dries. Okay, so now I'm gonna go ahead and flip this piece on top of this piece right here. And you can't see this, but on my side, I'm lining up those marks that I just made. Next, I'm going to grab an engagement clamp and put it on here sideways like this. And then I'm going to grab another engagement clamp and put it on here sideways right here. And what this is doing is this is making sure that both halves of this are lined up. I'm going to double check my mark. My mark looks good. And then I'm going to come 2 inches back from the tail right here. And I'm going to grab one of these push pins and I'm going to put it in. You want to make sure that there's actually something under the push pin. And then I'm going to tap this with my hammer. Now, when you tap this in, make sure you leave 1/8 of an inch of space so later on you can get a tool under there to pop this pin out. Because if you break off the metal part of this pin, you're not going to be able to run this through your planer later. Okay, so now that I've got the pin in so the pieces can't slide past each other when we put pressure on them, I can start putting spring clamps on. So I might as well start with a spring clamp at the end right here. And I'm going to put another spring clamp at the other end. And notice how I'm putting these on at an angle, and that gives me a little wider point of pressure so the sides don't curl up. And then I'm going to put a spring clamp in the middle. And then carefully, I can remove these 2 clamps. And then I can put a clamp here and here. Now, keep in mind, the number of clamps you need might change depending on how wide this particular glue up is. This is just what I'm doing for this particular lamination. Once again, I'm going to put these at a little bit of an angle. And then before I go on to the next one, I'm going to walk to the end of the table and I'm going to sight down the line of this just to make sure that I didn't put this together crooked. And if I did, I can tweak this joint a little bit until it looks nice and straight, and then I can go on to the next lamination. Now, before I glove up and start spreading the epoxy, there's a couple more things I want to mention. First one is that different glues have different clamping requirements. So for example, if I was actually going to use that Titebond joint that I just made, I would put a couple more spring clamps on it because PVA glue likes to have a lot of pressure. Now, on the other hand, if I was using Gorilla Glue, I would feel fine with that many spring clamps, at least for that wide of a lamination. And then with epoxy, I would never put more than that many spring clamps on that size of lamination, because with epoxy, if you squeeze it too tightly, it pushes the glue out and then you don't have a very strong bond. Now, something that relates to that is for these particular scarf joints, even though we didn't thicken the epoxy for the laminations, we are going to thicken the epoxy with some silica powder for the scarf joints, because making it a little bit thicker gives it a little more volume, which means that when you squeeze it together, it's going to be less likely to squeeze out the sides. So I'm going to mix some Cabasil into this until it's about the consistency of mayonnaise or maybe jam, and then we're going to spread that onto the joint, and then we're going to do the clamping. Good morning, guys. So it's the next day. I just took a few minutes to take all the clamps off of those scarf joints that we made yesterday, and then took them all outside and set them on the rack. We're going to come back to that later. And then I took a few minutes to plane down the frames and also the stems to their finished thickness. Started out just by cleaning up one edge with a power planer to make sure that it was nice and smooth. And then I was able to run them through my big Parks planer But I want to give you a word of caution here, and that is not all feed roller systems will allow you to turn a piece like you saw me doing there. So before you try to run a stem or a frame through a planer, make sure you cut a curved test piece and make sure you can actually move it that way, because if you can't, it's just going to keep pulling that thing sideways straight through the machine, probably going to damage your machine and definitely going to screw up your workpiece. So I think this is a pretty good stopping point for this particular video. Also, I just want to mention from here out, I'm not going to be mentioning what day it is every time I sit down to give a video, because I'm only working on this thing for a couple hours here and there, and that day by day just doesn't make any sense. So instead, I'm just going to start talking about what we're doing while we're doing it. And then at the end of the build, I'll share my timesheets to show you how long each part of the process took. Okay, so that's it for now. As usual, if you like this video, make sure you hit that like and subscribe button. Also, think about clicking that notification bell so you find out when these videos come out. And if you're interested in this particular skin-on frame boat or any of our skin-on frame boats, make sure you check out our website, capefalconkayaks.com, where we have skin-on frame building video courses, plan sets, and various free skin-on frame resources. You can also find us on Instagram at Cape Falcon Builds, where we post photos and videos of whatever we're working on in the shop or whatever we're testing out on the water. And you can find that same content on the Cape Falcon Kayak Facebook page as well. All right, that's it for now. Take care. Be safe on the water. I will see you in the next video.